So I'd like to say a very good morning to all of you, and particularly to the chairperson of our board, Mr. Marcel Golding, members of our board, and invited guests, our acting chief executive, and all of you. And a really great pleasure to see you folks here. They're called graduands. They're not graduates yet. That comes in a few minutes. So at this particular point, graduands, I say to you how proud it is to be standing here in front of you. So I found our Chief Executive Officer's welcome to you this morning deeply inspirational. I saw it some weeks ago and thought that this theme that he had chosen, Sawubona, I see you, was extremely insightful. As a social commentator Bridget Edwards says, Sawubona, I see you, is not simply saying hello. Like the Hindi greeting, namaste, it has many important meanings. One of them, as Bridget Edwards says, is this: the God in me sees the God in you. I see myself in your eyes. In the wider Zulu tradition, she carries on to explain, the greeting requires the reply, ngikona, which means I am here. Making clear, in some senses, that until you saw me, I didn't exist. She goes on to say that the isiZulu saying, umuntu, ngumentu, nagabantu, a person is a person because of other people, clarifies the meaning and significance of the greeting. As a gesture, it is simultaneously deeply social and spiritual. So thank you, Mr. Dramat, for your message. It was insightful for the times out of which we have come, the times we live in now, and the times into which we are entering. It is timely as we South Africans commemorate 30 years of our democracy, and as we acknowledge how the idea of Sawubona has changed our lives in some ways, and let me say, sadly, not in others. It is timely as we watch with great sadness the trauma of war and conflict around the world, in Gaza, in the Sudan, in Myanmar, and in the Ukraine, in our own backyards, in Nyanga, Philippi, and many parts of our country. I took particularly from Mr. Dramat's message his words, and I'm quoting him now, in a world increasingly divided by walls, both physical and metaphorical, Sawubona becomes a bridge. He urges us then to see beyond the surface, to recognize the struggles, aspirations, and I quote him, and humanity that connects us all. And so, graduates, I'd like to stay with our CEO's theme this morning. I want to go to that idea of the bridge to which he introduces us. That bridge is education. We as human beings cannot think enough about what education means, specifically in this context of human interaction, because the process of walking the bridge, crossing over, involves many things. Most important of these is what many philosophers talk of as recognition. We cross over and expect to see things, people, a world which we will recognize. But with all this complexity of our lives, with the frequency with which we now encounter new experiences, new places, new people, every day, that process of crossing doesn't get easier. It gets more difficult. The difficulty is manifold. It is manifold because crossing the bridge is fundamentally about a process of how we make sense. How we make sense of what is there in front of us. So let me talk for a minute about what that making sense is. And my darling wife, who read this before, said to me, "Stop being like a teacher." It's very hard not to be a teacher, let me say. But let me try and explain in a way which I hope is both educational but also meaningful for all of you. So this process of crossing the bridge begins with the ways in which the everyday life, the things around us, are brought into our heads, our consciousness, into our understanding. But a difficulty with which we have to deal in crossing that bridge is that nothing in our lives, in our existence, comes to us as it actually is. I hope that makes sense. Nothing comes to you when you see it as it actually is. We don't cross that bridge and automatically know and understand what is there in front of us. The process of seeing is, of course, a biological gift given to us by nature. Our eyes, as the eyes of all living creatures, make it possible for us to detect things in front of us. This is the gift of vision. To achieve vision, our eyes and brains work together. Lenses in our eyes focus light on our retinas, which convert the light into nerve signals, which are then sent to our brains. Our brains receive the signals and then must decode them to make sense of what we are seeing. That's quite teacherly, isn't it? But this is where the complexity starts, because decoding that signal in our brains is not an automatic thing. Because it comes to each of us, and this is really important, differently. For each of us, it is different when we see. Making sense, of course, is another nature which nature has given us. It is not, however, just biological. What we see or think we're seeing is a process called perception. Perception is different to vision. Perception is that process whereby, in that sense-making, we begin to classify the things that are happening in front of us. We classify them into things. So, here's the heart of the story. If you see something for the very first time, without having been told about it, it will make no sense to you whatsoever. It'll simply be a thing. It'll probably remain a mystery until something has helped you to come to make sense of it, to engage with it, fiddled with it, looked it up and down, and given it a name. Remember the children's storyteller, Dr. Seuss? Yeah? How many of you know Dr. Seuss? Yeah? Put your hands up. Good. So, Dr. Seuss understood perfectly this complexity of perception. He gave wonderful names to creatures who popped up in his imagination. Wockets, a bizarre company of creatures of all kinds, a lorax, the spotted atrocious, and then two characters in his book, his classic book, The Cat in the Hat, to whom he did not give names. They simply became to him Thing 1 and Thing 2. So what am I doing here, friends? I'm trying to make the point that perception is a learned thing. We have, through our parents, our friends, our teachers, or through our reading, had that thing one and thing two that Dr. Seuss encountered named for us. For example, your parents reading The Cat in the Hat to you may be called on by an insistent you to say, "Mummy, what is that thing one and what is that thing two?" If you were creative parents, I'm sorry, I'm making no judgment about you. You may say to your child, "Okay, child, you make up a name to them. You make up a name for them." Now, you may or may not. I hope your parents do that. I hope you give, that opportunity to your children. Because if you do, what you're doing is engaging in that great exercise which every culture in the world undertakes. It classifies things and gives names to things. So just think about this. When you talk to somebody who comes out of an isiXhosa background, they will describe a cow to you in very different ways in which somebody who has a classic European education. Very different. So when you take the time at doing that and you think about thing one and thing two in Dr. Seuss, you may say to your child, "Let's try and find a way of doing this. What do you see in front of you?" You may say, "This thing one has big blue hair. Let me give it a name." And a name that might make sense might be, "I'm a big blue." My own children did that. They did that for very strange things. For example, they didn't know the name for the weights that you hang on tablecloths and outside tables to ensure that they didn't flap in the wind. You know those things, don't you? They hang on the edge of the tablecloths. So my children decided that these things should be called tricycles. So to this day, in my family, everybody knows what you're talking about when you talk about these darn tricycles that you can't find. But they're very clear about, what it is that we're talking about. And what they were doing is that they were engaged in this great act of classifying. It was all good, wholesome. But what I want to say to you, that classifying can also be what the modern philosopher Judith Butler says is dark. We have dark ways of classifying. This is when one's perception is determined by bad classification. Bad classification is when the explanation which is prepared for us, for our sense-making, ends in what Mr. Drummond was talking about, prejudice, unwarranted and unjustified dislike and even hate. So think here of those of you who are sociologists, political science students, think of Frantz Fanon's famous discussion in his book, Blackface, White Masks, about a French child seeing a black man on a winter's day somewhere in France. The child says to his mother, "Look at the," and then uses the N-word, which I can't say. "Mama, a Negro." Fanon then proceeds to comment about how in that act of explanation, the man's body was given back to him, sprawled out, distorted, recolored. He says the little boy throws himself into his mother's arms. "Mama, the nigger's going to eat me up." Now, where did the boy get that from? He just didn't make it up. What the boy saw and how he made sense of what he saw, the process of classifying, was learned. He learned it from somebody who had taught him that what he was seeing was a Negro and that Negroes eat people up. So we have seeing here, but it is based on very problematic classification. The thing is, of course, that as human beings, we will never stop classifying. But we have to be conscious always of how we do that and the consequences of how we do it. So this is where your education graduates comes in. When education works poorly, it hands over to the learning mind forms of classification that make that gift of vision a complete liability. It turns perception into paralyzing prejudice. A police officer sees a young black man and instantly sees danger. We have here classic recognition. I see you, says the police officer, but he's not seeing a human being. They're seeing what the education has prepared them for. It's prejudice. So I'm a sociologist, and I'm fighting with my sociology friends every single day, simply about how we come to do our work. And I apologize to those of you who might be sociologists here in the room. I fight with them because they use descriptions, they use these perceptions in ways often that do the explanation before they have done their work as sociologists. Just think of this. So here's an example. Often, those, particularly you graduates, haven't you read something that goes like this? Linda Smith was a colored woman who lived in Cape Town. So, what does one do with that? You might think that the description is perfectly acceptable, and I'd say to you that it may be under certain circumstances, but to use a sociological term, it completely overdetermines Linda Smith by already having described her as this colored woman. Because I want to say to you that that description tells you nothing about Linda Smith. Nothing. Linda Smith may be a very bad woman, doesn't tell you that. She may be a really great woman, gives you no sense at all about that. But that's how my field constitutes Linda. And I'm sorry if there are any Linda Smiths in the room. So we know Linda Smith before we've even begun to do this work of coming to try to make sense of who Linda Smith is. It's put her in a particular category of description before it has had the chance to make a proper sense of her. It constitutes a particular kind of bridge. It takes you over with suspicion, even a readiness to fight. You will say, I see you, but what you see, your perception is classified as that which is not what is actually there. So Judith Butler calls this recognition a recognition that bears features of a readiness to dominate. So I'd like to say to you, when education works well, it is very conscious of itself. It won't stop you from making classifications and judgments, but it'll put your whole sense-making apparatus, your vision and your perception on notice. It will say every waking minute of your day, I am bringing my life experience to this act of seeing, and to say to you, now, what must I do now? What must I do? And I want to say to you graduates, doing that, pausing, taking your time, never see it as a weakness. Never see that as a kind of disability. Don't think that you have to instinctively always say what is at the top of your mind, and at the tip of your tongue. Hold yourself. So each of us has to ask ourselves, each of us, what sense-making skills and knowledges do I have, and how do they work for me? How do you begin to take positions, postures of complete self-consciousness every single minute of your life? I'm going to say to you, of course, it's a difficult thing, but we can make it instinctive. It's going to change you. For some of you here, it will be difficult. It will make your speech, gestural and reactive responses less immediate. And people will say to you at first, "You're a little stiff, aren't you?" They may even say to you that you're uppity. You're full of yourself. But don't take that, I want to say to you. Don't take it. You are uppity when you are disrespectful. When you're disrespectful of people. And having formal education does do that to some of you. And I say to your parents, if you see that in your children, tell them. Tell them you dislike the way in which they are carrying themselves. But never be embarrassed about being cautious, about taking the time to think. Because taking that time to think is you giving honor to this education that you received. And it works well when you come into these spaces of having to make sense, and you exercise then that obligation to try to know properly. This is pausing. When you say, how do I now do this? So graduates, I close off by saying that you are now walking that bridge. But I'd like to say to you, please do so consciously. You are crossing with a desire to want to recognize the other for who they actually are. And they will have much that you will have to work with. It will take effort, but the value of that effort is great. You will learn. And that learning is a great, great, great thing. Sawubona, you will then say, I see the human in you. So go forward in this great journey you're about to embark on. Ready yourself to cross the difficult bridge you will encounter every single day of your life. Take with you always the great gift of your education. Make it count. Thank you.